1942. The North Atlantic. The water temperature was 2 degrees Celsius. A man who fell in without a survival suit had approximately 7 minutes before his muscles stopped working. In winter, sometimes less. The convoys crossing from Halifax to Britain were sailing through a killing ground that the German U-boat command called the Happy Time, a phrase coined because Allied shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced, and the men doing the sinking were losing almost nothing in return. The mathematics of the Atlantic War in 1942 were simple and they were catastrophic. Germany was destroying Allied merchant tonnage at a rate that threatened to strangle Britain entirely. Food, fuel, ammunition, war materials, everything that kept Britain fighting and everything that would eventually allow the Allied armies to land in Europe crossed that ocean in slow convoys of gray ships, and the U-boats were finding them and killing them with a consistency that British Admiralty planners were beginning to describe in language that stopped just short of despair. The Royal Canadian Navy was given responsibility for the western half of the Atlantic convoy routes. A navy that had started the war with 13 warships and a few thousand men was suddenly asked to protect the lifeline of the entire Allied war effort across millions of square kilometers of ocean. The Royal Canadian Navy was not ready. It did not have enough ships. It did not have enough trained men. It did not have the equipment. What it had was the problem, a deadline that was effectively the duration of the war, and the Canadian institutional characteristic of improvising solutions to impossible situations with whatever happened to be available. What followed over the next 3 years is one of the most consequential and least celebrated naval campaigns in the history of the Second World War. By 1943, the Royal Canadian Navy was escorting approximately half of all Allied convoy crossings in the North Atlantic. By 1945, it had grown from 13 ships to nearly 400, and the men who crewed those ships, fishermen from Nova Scotia, factory workers from Ontario, farm boys from the prairies who had never seen salt water before enlisting, had developed anti-submarine tactics that directly contributed to turning the Battle of the Atlantic from a German victory into a German defeat. But the story that the history books do not tell is not about the ships or the statistics. It is about what happened on HMCS St. Croix in September 1943, and what the men of that ship and the ships around it discovered about what it actually cost to win the North Atlantic. Croix was a destroyer, one of the older American-built flush-deck ships transferred to Canada early in the war. By September 1943, she had been on Atlantic convoy escort duty for over 2 years, an eternity in a campaign where the average life expectancy of a U-boat was measured in patrols and the average life expectancy of the men hunting them was measured in the same grim currency. On September 20, 1943, St. Croix was part of the escort for convoy ONS-18 when the convoy was hit by a coordinated wolf-pack attack, multiple U-boats operating in concert, a tactic that German Admiral Karl Donitz had developed specifically to overwhelm convoy escorts by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The mathematics of the Wolfpack were designed to ensure that while the escort was occupied with one contact, other submarines were positioning for attacks that the escort could not prevent. St. Croix was hunting a U-boat contact when she was struck by a torpedo from U-305. The ship did not sink immediately. She was struck again. Then she went down. Of her crew of 147 men, 81 survived the sinking and were in the water. The water temperature was cold enough to be lethal within minutes without flotation. The British corvette HMCS Polyanthus moved to rescue survivors and was herself torpedoed and sunk by U-952. More men in the water. The British frigate HMS Itchen arrived and began pulling survivors from both ships out of the North Atlantic. She recovered 81 men total from St. Croix and Polyanthus combined. Then, 2 nights later, Itchen herself was torpedoed by U-666 and sunk. Of the 81 men she had rescued, 3 survived, 3 men out of 81. The rescue ship had become a death trap. The act of stopping to save lives in the North Atlantic in 1943 carried the same statistical weight as the attack that had created the casualties in the first place. This is documented. The numbers are exact. And the implications of those numbers were something that every escort commander in the Royal Canadian Navy had to carry, because the decision about whether to stop and rescue survivors while the wolf pack was still active was not a tactical abstraction. It was a question about the value of human life measured against the value of the convoy and the ships still afloat. The men who made those decisions were not admirals in comfortable offices. They were junior officers in their 20s and 30s, soaking wet on the bridge of a corvette in a North Atlantic gale, with U-boat contacts on the Azdic and men in the water behind them and a convoy they were responsible for ahead of them. The Royal Canadian Navy wrote no doctrine for this decision. There was no correct answer in the manuals. What developed instead was the specific moral calculus of men who had faced the question enough times to have formed a view about it, a view that was never formally articulated, but that the records of the campaign show was consistently acted upon. You finish the hunt first, then you come back. This was not callousness. The men who left survivors in the water while they prosecuted a U-boat contact did not do so easily or quickly forget it. The oral histories collected from Royal Canadian Navy veterans after the war contain accounts of those moments that are among the most psychologically unsparing documents in the Canadian military record. Men describing the specific sound of voices in the water as their ship moved away from them. The calculation running in parallel: if I stop now, I lose the contact. The U-boat escapes, it attacks the convoy tonight, more men die, while the voices got quieter behind them. But the doctrine, informal and unwritten as it was, worked. The Battle of the Atlantic turned in 1943. The combination of improved technology, better ASDIC, airborne radar, long-range patrol aircraft, and improved tactics, many of them developed by Royal Canadian Navy escort commanders through the brutal education of operational experience, broke the Wolfpack system that had made 1942 so catastrophic. By May 1943, U-boat losses had reached a level that Dönitz himself acknowledged was unsustainable. He withdrew his submarines from the main convoy routes. The happy time was over. The Royal Canadian Navy had escorted 25,343 merchant ship crossings during the Battle of the Atlantic. It had lost 24 warships and 2,024 men. The merchant ships it protected carried the fuel, food, and war materials that kept Britain in the war and supplied the Allied armies that eventually liberated Europe. The calculation is the same one that runs through every piece of this history. What did it cost? What did it purchase? It cost 2,024 Canadian sailors and 24 ships. It purchased the supply line that made D-Day possible. It purchased the fuel that ran Patton's tanks across France. It purchased the ammunition that fed the guns at Ortona and the Scheldt and every other engagement where Canadian soldiers fought on the far side of an ocean. Without the Atlantic crossing, none of it happens. The men who kept that crossing open are buried in cemeteries in Nova Scotia and in the North Atlantic itself, where the water is still 2 degrees and the shipping lanes run over the wrecks of the ships they went down with. Their war had no front line, no territory to take and hold, no ridge to stand on at the end of the day and say, "We took that." Their war was a gray horizon in every direction and a sound on the ASDIC and a decision to make in the next 30 seconds that the manual could not help with. They made those decisions 25,343 times, and the convoys got through. The Royal Canadian Navy is not a story that gets told at the level it deserves. The armies get the monuments. The air forces get the films. The navies get the technical histories read by specialists in libraries. The men who spent 3 years on the North Atlantic, the most dangerous sustained operational environment of the entire war, came home to a country that was grateful in the abstract and largely ignorant of the specifics. The specifics are these. A man on a corvette in the North Atlantic in 1942 had a shorter life expectancy than a man in any other branch of any Allied service. The cold killed faster than the weapons. The isolation was absolute. Days and weeks out of sight of land, surrounded by water that was trying to kill you through physics alone before any German ever entered the equation. The ships were small, and they were loud, and they smelled of diesel and wet wool and the specific biological outputs of men who had not slept properly in weeks. And every man on every one of those ships understood, in a way that ground soldiers never quite had to, that there was no retreat available. You could not fall back to a safer position. You could not dig a trench and wait for the situation to improve. There was the ship and the ocean and the convoy behind you and the U-boat somewhere beneath you and the decision that had to be made in the next 30 seconds. 25,343 merchant ship crossings, each one a decision. Each one the supply chain that built the victory. The gray horizon does not remember their names. The ocean never did. But the records show what they did, and the arithmetic of what they purchased with it is written in every Allied operation that happened on the far side of that water. They kept the sea lanes open. Without them, nothing else was possible.